Okay, so we're going to talk about coronavirus and the economic implications. Before we get there, let me spend a minute or two on the National Economic Education Delegation. This is a nonprofit that I founded about 3 years ago with the notion that the economics profession doesn't do a very good job of educating the electorate on what we know about economic policy issues. And I think that shows up when politicians increasingly use economics as a weapon for their own personal agenda rather than as a tool for social good. So NEED has as its mission trying to motivate the economics profession to get out and give talks to organizations such as this one, to Rotary Kiwani. We do a lot of speaking to seniors in high school economics courses and retirement communities. We're putting together a bunch of slide decks on a bunch of different topics in a very nonpartisan way. That is to say that we don't ever advocate for a particular policy response. We merely talk about what the different policy options are. I've been getting a lot of buy-in from the economics profession. I've got 52 members of an honorary board, which includes Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, the two previous chairs of the Federal Reserve, 6 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, a bunch under both D and R Republicans, so again, nonpartisan. We've got some Nobel Prize winners and 520 plus PhD, largely academic economists who are contributing by giving talks and helping to write slide decks and generally promote NEED's mission. We have a bunch of different topics. As I mentioned, we have a nice deck on housing policy and a couple of delegates who are expert in that, should you like to hear from them. Today's coronavirus economics. I do want to put it out there that if any of you in the audience are members of another organization that brings in speakers, please give me a shout and I'll send my contact information to AJ in a way that he can forward to the rest of you. Would love to set you up with a speaker, me or somebody else on any of these topics. All right, so let's move on to coronavirus. First, about this slide deck, as are all of our slide decks, this one was crowdsourced from amongst the delegation. Myself, Scott Bayer, the chair of the economics department at Clemson University, and Jeffrey Woglum at Amherst College. We jointly put this together. So what am I going to talk about? I am going to talk about what is this? It's a question, the answer to which seems somewhat self-evident, but I'll reframe it just a little bit. We'll provide some evidence of the impact, look at the broader economy and stock market. And we'll talk about government policy, how effective it has been. And then we'll look at what the path might be going forward. And yes, we'll devote a little time at the end to talking about both residential and commercial real estate, and I'll be happy to take Q&A once we're all done. Okay, so the first question, what is this? All right, well, it's a natural disaster with important twists. When I really think conceptually about what's going on, I do sort of frame it in the same way that I do a hurricane, flooding, earthquake, fires, what have you, but there are some important differences. One of the important differences is that this is global. We often think of a natural disaster as happening in one place, and then everybody runs in and with money and resources to aid that region. That's not possible now because everybody all over the world is suffering. The duration of it is unpredictable. If you think about flooding, if you think about earthquakes, hurricanes, and whatnot, the duration is, we generally think of it as being finite and relatively short-lived. This one is clearly not short-lived. But what's more is that its duration is somewhat under our control. Right? The better we manage the virus, the more of us go outside with mask on, the shorter is the duration going to be, and the less intense is the pandemic going to be. So it's also true that the economic toll is enormous and potentially durable, and I'll talk about some of the changes that might come as a result of the pandemic as evidence of the durability. So it's a health crisis that's spilled over onto the economy, and so we've got a massive recession going on. In the second quarter of this year, the economy fell by about 32% on an annualized basis. And that's because it is the perfect storm of economic difficulty. When I talk about recessions starting, we usually talk about how they originate in one of 3 different places, either the financial sector, demand side, or the supply side. From the supply side, you think back to oil price shocks in the late 1970s. OPEC restricted supply, price went up, and people stopped buying other things, which led to a recession. Demand side, we can go back to the global financial crisis, which to the extent that all of you were in housing a decade ago, you're intimately familiar with. Home prices went up and people used their home as an ATM. So when prices stopped going up and started going down, the ATM closed and consumption slowed, causing a recession that was ultimately aided in its depth by difficulties on the financial side. Right. Important for this episode is that there is no culprit. If you think back to the global financial crisis, there was one side of the aisle saying, well, homeowners, you should have known better, you shouldn't have taken out these loans. And the other side of the aisle was saying, well, Wall Street, you and your financial innovation, for what it's worth, you're responsible for this, so we can't help you out. Well, there's no culprit. So there was originally no political bickering. And both the Federal Reserve and Congress acted very quickly and very strongly. And I'll argue a little bit later on that that was crucial in sort of stopping the bleeding a little bit. I'll also argue that Congress is now shirking its responsibility by bickering in a political way. Okay, so let's take a look at the economy. I think one of the most important indicators as to how we're doing is consumer spending. Right, this consumer spending drives 70% of the economy, and drops in consumer spending. This blue line up here at the top, that's total consumer spending. It fell precipitously in the early part of March and stayed down about 35% below normal for about 3 weeks. I'm always shocked when I see this, that we were just sort of sheltered in place for about 3 weeks, and then we started, boom, coming back out. So to a point where spending is now only down 7.3% relative to where it was in January. Right now, the economy should have grown and spending should be higher, probably around 4 or 5% higher. So we're down probably 10, 11% over where we otherwise would have been. Right? Restaurants, spending on restaurants and hotels, that's still down by about a quarter. And spending on transportation is also down by about a half. It started recovering, but that recovery has plateaued as the number of cases has increased. Right, so spending's on the rise. There's some evidence here at the end that maybe it's starting to decline again. And that's because more and more around the country, things are starting to close back up just a little bit because of the increase in cases. Right, so we can look at employment. This is a graph that I've been presenting for years. And had I presented it to you about 8 months ago, this period, which was the global financial crisis, that would have looked like a mountain of job losses. And we thought it was horrible back then when we were losing 700,000 jobs a month. But what's happened recently has made a molehill out of that mountain in this graph, because in March we started losing jobs more than 1 million, and then in April we lost almost 21 million jobs just in 1 month as we shut down. Now, jobs have been coming back, but we're still only about halfway back. We're still down at least 10 million jobs relative to where we were prior to the pandemic, right? And that's not to say where we are relative to where we otherwise would have been, because employment would have continued to grow. We can look at unemployment, although I really don't like to. You can see that the unemployment rate peaked at about 14.7%. That's the highest level that we have recorded in the post-World War II era. It's lower than recorded during the Great Depression. Then we had unemployment rates upwards of 25%, not directly comparable. And I think that these numbers are wrong, right? The latest number on unemployment was 8.4%, and I frankly don't believe that for a second. The BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which produces these data, has itself confessed that there's been a coding error that led to an underreporting of unemployment. In April, it should have reported something in excess of 20%, and in May should have been something in excess of 16%. Right, so I think we're probably still in the double digits, whether it's 11 or it's 13, I don't know. It's simply that our unemployment reporting mechanisms are not up to the task here, because the way that people answer questions is not reflective of their true unemployed status. I think these numbers are also low because an enormous amount of the working population is now working part-time. where they prefer to work full-time, and they were working full-time prior to the pandemic. If we include those, then this 14.7 number goes up to around 17%, and this 8.4 number goes up to around 14%. Right, so there's still an enormous amount of the labor force that is not working to the extent that it was prior to the pandemic. Now, early on, when things started to go haywire, we didn't have much data, but the most timely data that we had were new unemployment claims. That is, how many people filed an unemployment insurance claim in a given week. Right? And here we've got the pattern going back to the global financial crisis. And we see that at the peak of the global financial crisis, there were at most 665,000 people filing an unemployment insurance claim in the worst week. Right? And things started getting better and better to the point where in an average week, we would have somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people applying for unemployment insurance. Well, that number very rapidly ticked up to about 7 million, right? Just under 7 million. And it stayed that way for a couple of weeks, and it's been steadily declining ever since, to the point where just this morning numbers came out indicating that last week just 860,000 people applied for unemployment insurance. Now, a lot of news reports say that this thing's getting better. I prefer to think of it as things getting worse at a slower rate, because 867,000 people is still enormously elevated relative to where we should be. Right? So there's still large numbers of people applying for unemployment insurance. And this also doesn't include the pandemic emergency unemployment insurance. I don't include those numbers because there's a fair amount of evidence that there's a lot of fraud. So if I included those numbers, it would be much higher numbers of people filing unemployment insurance claims, but I don't know that it's correct, and I think it would be overstating the case, so I'm just going to go with these. It gives you an idea of the trends. I actually prefer to look at the continuing unemployment claims, the number of people in any given week that are receiving unemployment. You can see this goes back to before the pandemic set in. And in a representative week, we'd have about 1.7 million people receiving unemployment checks. That quickly bumped up to about 25 million, and it's been coming down steadily to about half of its peak. Right? So we've been making progress, but still 12.6 million, that's very highly elevated relative to where we should be. So there is still an enormous amount of hardship going on out there. This number is also probably coming down because some folks are exceeding the maximum allotted time on unemployment. So they're falling off the rolls, but not because they're getting jobs. We can look at employment in California. Here, the blue line is employment in California. The maroon line is employment in the United States. And they're both normalized to 100 in February, so that we can see changes in employment relative to February. So the US as a whole is down about 9.6%, and California is down about 13.1%. Right? So the recession has hit a little harder and deeper in California than it has in much of the rest of the country. And that's partly because of the reliance on in California on tourism. Tourism has completely ground to a halt, and that's part of the difference here. We can look at the unemployment rate in California. Again, I don't put a lot of stock in the unemployment rate, but probably the relative difference between California and the United States as a whole is meaningful. The unemployment rate in California, right, no surprise, is a little bit higher than it is nationwide. Right? Again, partly because the employment change is bigger in California. We can turn to the stock markets. I'm reminded what Kai Ryssdal says about the stock market. He's on NPR. He always says that the stock market is not the economy, and I want to emphasize that, because why on earth have the stock markets completely rebounded when the economy is still in the doldrums? We'll talk about that a little bit. But first, let's look at what happened in the stock market. This is the red is the S&P 500, and the blue is the Dow Jones. This is early January. So things were going up, as the stock market is generally predisposed to do. Then we started hearing about coronavirus in China, and it stuttered a little bit, but didn't really lose its footing. Kept on going until February 19. And then we heard about Iran and Italy cases there. It's not going to be confined to China. So the stock market started dropping precipitously until the Federal Reserve stepped in here and dropped its federal funds rate down to about zero. The stock market responded favorably to that until we started hearing about Coachella Valley being canceled, March Madness being canceled, the NBA finals being canceled, the Major League Baseball season going away, and then bottomed down about 35% in just 1 month. And it bottomed there until the CARES Act was passed. Right? And that's when the stock markets decided, oh, okay, government's got our back, things are going to be okay. And the stock market started coming back up. It's been in fits and starts, of course, and somewhere along the year is where oil prices went negative, which was quite a surprise. Then it peaked up here, and then the theory for why this happened is because it's just profit taking. A lot of people recognize, oh, we've made some pretty good money, so it's time to pull out. And so I expect this to go back up and continue. Again, there are going to be fits and starts throughout this process, but the markets have largely recovered. All right, so that's a snapshot of what's going on with the economy. We can look at government policy during this. And there are really three varieties of government policy. There's the social policy, that's the social distancing, the shelter in place, and the please wear a mask. The fiscal policy, that's the CARES Act and other acts passed by Congress, all the spending. And then there's monetary policy, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. First, I want to spend just a little bit of time on the social policy and the whole notion behind flattening the curve. Right, so it's this curve that everybody talks about flattening, and it's the number of cases in a given day. And this curve is a representation of what we might have experienced had we not put any protective measures in place. Right? We would have seen a relatively rapid tick up in the number of cases, and it would have peaked at a relatively high level and then come down pretty quickly, perhaps because we have herd immunity, and then it would have been over. Right, so part of the importance in presenting this is that a lot of people I talk to think that sheltering in place is designed to get through this more quickly. What it's really designed to do is it's designed to respond to the fact that we have healthcare capacity constraints, right? If we just let it rip, didn't do anything, then all of these people would go without a healthcare, right? And so what we want to do is we want to push down on that top, and when we do that, we're going to push the cases out in time to something that looks like this, right? That's the trajectory that we should expect to see with protective measures, right? Now that those of you who are paying attention, you note that I didn't push this down below our healthcare capacity constraint because we bought a lot of time, right? Here, without any social distancing, that's when we would have hit the constraint. But we bought ourselves a lot of time, and in that time, we should have been and probably were expanding our healthcare capacity, right? So we want to push this down just enough so that we're below our expanded healthcare capacity so that everybody can get healthcare who needs it. Right? And the whole goal here is to save lives. It's estimated that we've saved between 200,000 and 2 million lives. And I'll talk in a minute about how much we might value that. Right? The problem is, and as an economist, I'm duly obligated to remind everybody that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Right? So we saved lives, but saving the lives came at a cost, and that cost was in terms of economic activity. Right? Without protective measures, you better believe we're going to have an economic impact. Not a huge economic impact. And with protective measures, the economic impact would be more severe, right? Because it would start immediately as we sheltered in place and shut down a bunch of businesses. It would be deeper than without protective measures, and it would go on for a longer period of time. Right? It goes on for a longer period of time, not only because we still have significant cases for a longer period of time, but think about the psychological hangover. Right, my co-author Scott Bayer from Clemson, he loves his football. Went to the national championship game and rejoiced when they won. But even he is saying, no, I'm not going to go back to a football stadium and spend Saturday afternoon with a bunch of my 80,000 of my closest friends. So there'll probably be a psychological hangover that will have people at home longer than they strictly need to be. Right, so the Economist Toolbox has a tool that allows us to compare lives saved with the added economic costs of protective measures. That's called cost-benefit analysis. So that involves saying, okay, what are the benefits of doing something and what are the costs? And if the benefits are bigger than the costs, then let's go ahead and do it. It's a good idea. So what are the benefits? Right? The benefits of social distancing are a bunch of lives saved. Right? We're going to estimate that at about 600,000. That's somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million. And we multiply that by the value of each life. And here we use $7 million as the value for each life. You could quibble with the $7 million number, and economists have estimated it to be anywhere between 5 and about 14 million. So we use 7, a number on the low side. But that gives us $4.2 trillion worth of lives saved. Add to that long-term health issues avoided, and guess there are 2 million, who knows how many, at $500,000 each, that's another $1 trillion. So the total benefit of social distancing, somewhere in the neighborhood of $5.2 trillion. Now there's a lot of stuff that we've left out, but still the number is pretty high. So let's compare that with the costs, right? And early on, we expected that the costs of shelter in place would be, amount to significant economic damage for about a quarter. And so we estimated that that would be about $1.3 trillion, right? Well, it doesn't take an economist to tell you that $1.3 trillion is less than $5.2 trillion, so it's a good idea. And it's actually a sort of rare moment of unanimity in the economics profession that all but a few agree that we did the right thing by closing down the economy and by social distancing and sheltering in place. The problem now is that we're not doing it very well. Right? We're coming out too soon. So this analysis was for the assumption that we would shelter in place and have appropriate social distancing and mask wearing, right? But we're not. And so what we're experiencing, we can go back to our graph, and this is optimal. This would have been best. And this passes a cost of benefit analysis. But what we're experiencing is really something like this, right? So we're adding on another hump here, another hump of cases, right? And that adds on a whole additional amount of economic activity. Right, and if we do this enough times, then it won't have made sense to have instituted protective measures. Now that said, there was no way to anticipate that we were going to do this so badly. So it was the right thing to do at the outset. But unfortunately, too many policymakers are caving to the pressure and opening up too soon. Okay, so that's it on social policy. This fiscal policy, here's the timeline. And I want to stress that I call this social insurance. I don't call it stimulus. Because it's not designed to stimulate and grow the economy. It's designed to make sure that those who need resources, be they individuals or be they firms, it's designed to make sure that those who need resources have access to them. Right? And that's about $3 trillion worth of spending. And the important thing to point out is that the last time Congress acted was in late April. We've now been May, June, July, August, and most of September, right, without any additional stimulus. And that $3 trillion worth of benefits has run out, right? The $600 unemployment insurance benefit ran out at the end of July. So those who remain unemployed no longer are receiving that benefit, right? So the stimulus, the social insurance is lacking, and we're in what I call a big fiscal policy gap. And I think this big fiscal policy gap is enormously expensive in terms of the hardship that it's incurring. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then there's monetary policy from the Federal Reserve, right? It's got two primary objectives: stabilize the economy, maintain liquidity of the system. And it does that by lowering the federal funds rate, lowering interest rates, injecting cash into the system. It does this by buying just tons and tons of US Treasuries. Trillions of dollars worth, and then it is pledged to shore up a bunch of debt and structures, right? Think about, there's the Main Street lending program where the Federal Reserve is going to help small businesses that are running in arrears on their loans, and that's something the Federal Reserve has never ever done. So Jerome Powell, the current chair of the Federal Reserve, picked up Ben Bernanke's playbook from the global financial crisis, and it's added a few plays of his own and has run with it. Here is the Federal Reserve timeline. I'm not going to go through it because it's very complicated and we don't have a whole lot of time. But for those of you that are interested, these slides will be available on NEED's website, and I'll send it to AJ, who can forward it to all of you at the end of the talk. So there's the Federal Reserve timeline. And I've got some thoughts on policies to date. What are they? Well, the costs are enormous, but we're doing the right thing, and we're doing it very quickly. I think that's very positive, and that was reflected in the NASDAQ, right? So here's the graph. The blue line is the trajectory of the NASDAQ during the global financial crisis, and the maroon line is the trajectory of the NASDAQ now, right? This is the peak before each of those crises, and the blue line, it kept going down for about 500 days. It took 500 days closing in on 2 years for the NASDAQ to reach its trough, right? The NASDAQ this time reached its trough in about 30 days because of the quick government action, both by the Federal Reserve and by Congress, to the point where the NASDAQ at its peak was some 16% above its peak before the coronavirus. There's been a correction over the course of the last week or so, but I fully anticipate that will change, right? This is again, as I mentioned, primarily profit taking. Okay, additional thoughts. I mentioned monetary policy. I think it's been terrific. I won't elaborate on that. Fiscal policy, I give it kind of an emergency pass. I think that it was balancing expediency with efficiency. A lot of money spent and handed out that didn't get to the right place. Did the direct cash payment get to the right folks? Did everybody who made less than $75,000 need it? Well, a lot of those folks still had their jobs. The Paycheck Protection Program, I'll show you in a minute that it didn't get where it really should have gone. So I'm not sure that we've pursued the right strategy to maintain employer-employee ties. And then what about states and local governments, right? And that's where the rubber hits the road for a lot of us in terms of government policy. Fire, police, education, that's all state and locally funded, and it's all in jeopardy as we go forward without federal help. Right, so let's have a quick look at the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and see did those loans go to the right place. Right, so the first thing to look at are the green bars, and there's the share of total jobs lost in April. Right, and 31% of those jobs were in accommodation and food services. Less in arts, entertainment, and recreation, less in construction, and much less in professional and technical services. Right. Second, we can look at the share of the total PPP loans dispersed, and only 8.1% went to accommodation and food services, whereas professional and technical services, 12.7% went to that industry. Right, and this is reflective of the ties, the relationship that small business owners had in accommodation and food services with their banks relative to professional and technical services. Right, that every financial services firm either is a bank or has very close ties to their banks, and so they ended up getting a lot of money and getting it really quickly. And I would guess that there are in the tens of billions of dollars that are just sitting in the bank accounts of financial firms. That did not make it to small businesses, right? There was also a racial component, right? First round loans went disproportionately to white congressional districts, right? And again, I think this is a reflection of the ties between the community and their banks, right? So white-owned businesses are on average more likely to have good ties with their banks than are minority-owned businesses, which tend to be smaller, right? So there was a racial component as well. Employment at small firms, the change between February and August, we lost on net about 2.3 million jobs, right? To the point where jobs in small businesses, and these are businesses with less than 50 employees, right? It's at about the same level that it was back in late 2013, right? All of the growth that happened in those several years, those 6 years between, right, has just disappeared. Hopefully it will come back, but I think that a lot of small businesses are going to be in a financially precarious position, even on the far end of all of this. So it may well be quite some time before that employment comes back. Let's look at for a second at government revenue. Right? California's revenue. Here's over time. This is revenue relative to the same time last year. Right? And here we've got April and May. So in May, sorry, the data don't go any beyond May. California's revenues were down 42% in May relative to the same time last year. As the U.S. as a whole, down only 29%. But still, these are enormous declines in government revenues. And without help from the federal government, it's going to mean enormous declines in the provision of government services. All right, whether that's fixing potholes, police, fire, education, all of that is going to be put in jeopardy fairly substantially because of this decline in revenue. There is talk in DC, of course, of more stimulus. Again, it's social insurance, not stimulus, right? It's about $500 billion worth. The major provisions are, continued expanded unemployment, but at $300 per week rather than $600. My sense is that that's probably okay. The 600 might have been an overreach. It's about $105 billion for education, helpful. $45 billion for testing, tracing, and vaccine production, and expand the Paycheck Protection Program. Right? It's also got a couple of sweeteners, the business liability protection. The Democrats are not very happy about that. And it's got post office funding, $10 billion. It turns into a grant for the post office. That would be helpful as all of us vote by mail in November. What's missing is a ton missing. Democrats think that there's about $2.5 trillion worth of spending that's missing. They proposed a $3 trillion package. I think most economists that I talk to and read what they say, and I agree that spending on the order of between 1.5 and 2 trillion is probably sufficient for now. Spend that and see what happens. So there's a bunch of stuff missing, right? If these $1,200 payments were a good idea back in March, April, they're still a good idea now. Reducing the $600 to $300 per week, again, I think that's probably okay. Reduces a little bit the disincentive effect to work. Why get a job when you're getting $600 extra per week from unemployment? We need flexible aid to state and local governments in the amount of about $1 trillion. And very importantly, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, we need housing and rental assistance, right? The current CDC eviction moratorium is simply not sufficient. Okay. The big question is, how do we pay for this, right? Well, we pay for it by borrowing. We borrow from the future. That probably means that economic activity will be reduced in the future. But the good news is that interest rates, the 10-year Treasury interest rate is down at about 0.7%. So interest rates, we can borrow very cheaply from the future. The bad news is that we had structural budget and debt issues long before the coronavirus pandemic set in. Right, here's a graph put out by the Congressional Budget Office, and this is showing the federal debt as a percentage of GDP. Right, so it waxes and wanes. You know, we had the Civil War, we borrowed a lot of money to fund it, and then it went down. We had the Great Depression, World War I. World War II was the peak. So debt was in excess of 100% of GDP. Debt was greater than GDP. Before the pandemic set in, our debt was at about 80% of GDP, and this was the forecast for debt. Right? It was going to go up, not because of war, not because of not because of recession, not because of any crisis, but simply because our politicians were not doing a very good job. It was at 80% before. We're at a little bit above 100% now. We're going upwards of 200% by 2050. Right. So that's a problem. But we live in California, so you can relate to this analogy, right? You know, if your house is on fire, you don't worry about the fact that you're in a drought. You just put the house up. Well, it turns out our economic house is on fire, and so we have to be spending this money. This is also general consensus within the economics profession, that we're doing the right thing. We need to support the most vulnerable in our society, and we need to maintain the structure of the economy as it existed beforehand, or the recovery is going to be extended. A ton of inequality, right? You've probably all heard about the racial inequities. Minority communities seem more susceptible to the virus and more likely to die from the virus. Telecommuting, this is benefiting those with sort of higher wage jobs, white collar as opposed to blue collar, right? Primarily low wage jobs are at risk. 40% of the jobs lost paid less than $40,000 a year. And most households had less than $400 in the bank to weather some sort of economic difficulty, right? $400 isn't going to get you very far in this. And then there are enormous educational inequities. I don't like teleeducation. To begin with, I don't like it even worse because a lot of low-income kids who don't have Wi-Fi in the home are going to be falling even further behind. So what does the future bring? Depends on our ability to harness the virus. We're going to get a lot of future government policy, I hope. There are going to be structural changes to the economy. We'll see how much telecommuting sticks around. It will certainly be elevated relative to pre-coronavirus, but I think that we're in kind of a telecommuting honeymoon. And so I think, you know, companies like Twitter who said, you know, nobody ever need come back into the office. I'm not sure that will stand the test of time, but we'll see. Telehealth. I would love to never have to go spend 45 minutes in my doctor's waiting room again. So that would be a productivity improver. And then there's education again. I think the silver line of teleeducation is that when kids do go back to school, the teachers will have tools at their disposal that they didn't before the crisis. Electronic tools that will make their teaching more effective. I think it's also going to there are also going to be significant changes in the way we buy things. A lot more people are buying things online than previously. Online purchases as a proportion of all retail have increased from 10% to 16% of all retail. That's an enormous increase. So I think a lot of retail, brick and mortar in particular, that existed previously simply won't recover. Growth projections, they're all over the place. Economists rely on history and intuition to make forecasts. We don't have any history for a period like this, so the forecasts range from like 9% down to only 5% down for 2020. I'm in the camp that thinks that the decline will be more like 8 to 9%, especially if we keep mismanaging things. But I think things will get better in 2021. We'll probably experience some positive growth, 4 to 5%, but that won't be enough to take us back to where we were in January of this year, let alone to where we otherwise would have been, right? There would have been economic growth throughout 2020, and we'll be missing out on that. The CBO, in fact, projects that we will not recover where we otherwise would have been until about 2029, right? So it is a long road to recovery from this recession. Partly it's a long road to recovery, and that's getting extended because we've been mismanaging, right? So we're getting, we were doing well here, and then came Memorial Day, and people started having barbecues. People started going out with masks. Number of cases ramped way up, and now it's in decline. There's a little tick up here over the course of the last week that has me concerned that we're headed back up again, but I hope not. The upshot from this is that we are causing a lot of hardship. Had we continued on the path that we are on here, we could have probably had things under control, the way a lot of European countries did. Now, a lot of European countries are seeing a resurgence, and we may well have too, but most did not experience this increase in cases. This increase in cases did not come with a corresponding increase in deaths, partly because it was a different demographic that was getting sick, less likely to die, younger folks. As well as the medical profession have found ways to treat it, to prevent death. So we're getting better at dealing with the virus, but really the way to deal with it is to reduce the number of cases significantly so we can go back on about our business. I apologize, here's a slide from what happened in Iowa. I meant to change that to California. I'll change that in the slides that I put up on the website. So I've talked about how this is hours worked at small businesses, and we saw them just plummet in a variety of industries. They've been coming back, and then lately they've been going back down again, right, as the economy is starting to close up a little bit. We can see that as well in requests for driving directions. The red line here, that's the request for driving directions by people with iPhones. Right, you can see that was ticking up the early part of the year, and then we hit the pandemic, went down to about half. It recovered and flew beyond where it was prior, but now we're starting to see a trend downward. Right? We're starting to see the economy, economic activity, and people's activity decline again. And this is a problem because opening up and closing the economy is not as simple as flipping a switch. For so many small businesses out there, it would have been much better for them to have stayed closed longer than they strictly needed to in order to get things under control, because opening up and then having to close back down again is enormously expensive. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of small businesses are on very precarious financial footing. Okay, now a little bit about real estate. From aggregate statistics throughout the US economy, here are home prices. These are FHA data. This is through the second quarter of this year. I didn't see much change from first quarter to second quarter. And that doesn't surprise me. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Housing starts have been low, very low throughout the recovery. The historical average is 1.4 million units on a monthly basis, annualized, right? That plummeted at first, but has come back. And in August, it was 1.4, exactly the historical average. So housing starts have recovered. So residential markets in the aggregate, I think are probably going to be reasonably steady. That said, rental markets are going to be probably a mess, right? There's the CDC moratorium on evictions, which I think only pushes the can down the road in two ways, right? It pushes evictions off until next year. And it also pushes the economic difficulty from renters to landlords and then on up to their banks. Right? If renters don't make their rent payments, then landlords can't make their mortgage payments. So there's going to be enormous difficulty. And I would like to see, as I mentioned earlier, I would like to see a lot of money for rent support in whatever Congress does, but I'll be surprised if that actually comes into being. I'll be surprised if that's allowed to go in. From owned homes, depends an enormous amount on your location. Right, there's a little bit of data. I just uploaded the latest data from Zillow this morning. We can see that markets in San Francisco are sluggish. Markets in Marin County have increased demand. I use these two counties, partly because I live here and partly because they're a good example of urban core where people are fleeing and suburban regions where people are fleeing too. Right, so if we look at Zillow's latest, right here, the last couple of months for San Francisco, they've been trending downward. It peaked just under 1.5 million, now it's at 1.4. And if we go over here and look at Marin County, we see that home prices are ticking up throughout the pandemic, right? So we get a lot of movement from places like San Francisco to places like Marin. So location matters a lot during the pandemic. In terms of commercial markets, this is largely driven by two things: economic activity and telecommuting. Right. In the short term, the lack of economic activity has led to a disaster, as has telecommuting. In the long term, it's really unknown. I think that there is going to be significant disarray in commercial markets for a while as we work through the whole telecommuting thing. There's going to be disarray as the economy recovers and disarray as we figure out telecommuting. And there's going to be a rearrangement of commercial real estate. If you were somebody who had commercial real estate coming online in March, April, May, I figure that was really unfortunate for you. And it really depends on how the whole telecommuting thing shakes out. How does the space in inner core areas? There's going to be reduced demand in inner core areas. And increased demand, I think, for smaller spaces in suburban areas. Even for those who telecommute, it might be untenable for a lot of them to really be home officed, especially during this period when maybe you've got young kids who are homeschooling. I know my 12-year-old is sometimes a distraction. Oh, of course, a welcome distraction, but it's a distraction nonetheless. Okay, and my bottom lines, this is a health crisis with enormous macroeconomic implications. The surprise is the inequities that are enormous. GDP this year, I think, likely to contract about 9%, positive growth coming back in 2021. This policy gap is a disaster, leading to hunger, evictions, foreclosures, and additional deaths, right? Financial insecurity leads to stress, leads to, for many people, additional deaths. The loss of GDP, it could result in a loss of GDP ultimately of 4 to 5%. And unemployment up 4 to 5 points. These are estimates by the Congressional Budget Office. There are some economists who think that it might just be time to shut the whole thing down again for maybe a term of 4 to 6 weeks. And that way we could get the number of cases down very significantly. I'll weigh in just quickly on what's happening in academia. I think that the drive for money has overwhelmed good sense, and kids are back in school who really shouldn't be. And don't get me started on college football. The Big Ten just announced that they're going to play after all, and I think that is a huge mistake. Okay, that's what I have. Here's some information about need and how to contact me should you like to. I will send all of this information to AJ, who will hopefully forward it on to you. But at this point, I'll stop sharing. And AJ, if you want to moderate a little Q&A, be happy to stick around for as long as you'd like me to. AJ?
You're muted.
Sorry, I always do that. Sorry about that.
Thank you so
much. No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jon. I really appreciate it. That was very, very good. I'm gonna monitor the chat and see if there's any questions. I do have one, so let me get that started. In your model of policy response, the distancing, the idea you said that is to also increase the health capacity of the system. Is there any evidence that that has actually happened?
Not a ton of evidence that that's happened. We've expanded capacity because our healthcare workers, sort of organically, because our healthcare workers have simply figured out how to do it better, and that expands capacity. It's not clear. We had that little lull there where a lot of places were able to stock up on their PPE, and to the extent that that expanded capacity, but otherwise, it's not clear that we have done a ton to expand capacity.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else wants to ask any questions? You can unmute yourself or send me the questions through the chat.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Julia.
How do you even go about estimating lives saved? I'm curious how that's got to be. I can't even imagine where you start on estimating that. What do you do?
On estimating the number of lives saved?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to have to punt on that. So that's what the epidemiologists do.
Oh, okay.
They've got models in place that have been formulated over decades and decades. So they do that, and the economist jumps in when it comes time to say, okay, for each of those lives saved, how much money, right? What's the benefit of that? And economists, lawyers, and actuaries are sort of comfortable putting a dollar value on life. Many people aren't, but in order to really make the comparison, you have to. And economists come up with that value of life by actually looking at people's choices. There are different jobs that have different likelihood of death, different levels of risk. And so you can look at how much you have to pay somebody to take that added level of risk, and use that information to say, well, people have revealed that they value their lives in the amount of about $7 million, as we estimate. And methodologies differ, so we get a range from about $7 to $14 million.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me go with the first one. Ryan DeYoung asked, what do you expect will be the effect of Trump or Biden as president next year? So the election result, the question that nobody wants to answer.
Yeah. So I suspect that the stock markets will take a little bit of a hit if Biden is elected. That said, the economy has actually traditionally done better under Democratic presidents than Republicans, so the stock market will probably bounce back. If Biden is elected, where it really matters is who has control of the Senate, right? And assuming that we're still in the soup come January, when Biden is would actually be sworn into office if he wins, it's much more likely that we would get more social insurance if Democrats control all three houses. If Republicans are in control of the Senate when the time comes, I think it would be extremely difficult to get more social insurance, and difficult to get more stimulus when the time comes.
Excellent. The next question is, how do death rates, my guess is COVID-19 death rates, affect the economy, if it affects it at all?
So the number of deaths and the demographics of the deaths are having, the number of deaths simply isn't that large to have a dramatic impact, to have even a measurable impact on the economy. We're at 350 million, and I think deaths are around 200,000 at this point. So the number of deaths can't affect the aggregate economy in a measurable way. But the pattern, right, there are certain industries, like nursing homes, that are going to be decimated for a while because of this. So the number of deaths from an economic standpoint, not significant yet. Okay. From a human standpoint, very significant, enormous, and tragic.
Right. The next question is, are owners and renters borrowing to pay their bills? And if so, want the personal debt that they have a long-term impact that maybe, that you didn't address, or that it wasn't, mentioned in your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely it will. I mean, for renters, for owners, for small businesses, small businesses are borrowing from wherever they can, from their own personal credit cards, from company credit cards. And I imagine that renters are putting more stuff on their credit cards. So I would expect to see, credit card debt, revolving debt accelerate as we come out of this. And that certainly will have implications for the economy going forward. People just won't be able to spend as much as they otherwise would have. Spending drives 70% of the economy. So that will be a drag on the economy for sure.
Perfect. The next question is, you cover residential, commercial. Is there any projections as to what's going to happen or what happens with ag properties at this time, and if that change tends to lag behind other sectors?
I'm sorry, with agricultural properties?
Yeah, ag properties.
Yeah, I don't know. But I would assume that would be a segment of real estate that would be reasonably sheltered. We've seen increases in food prices to the extent that that's trickling down to the farmers. That would make them a little bit more solvent than they otherwise might be. So I would be more sanguine about the ag sector than about almost any other sector of the economy.
Yeah, I think that the most important issue with ag right now is still, even pandemic or not, is water. If you have water to, irrigate your crops, right? Okay.
Yep.
The next question is about the fires. They're asking particularly about the Creek Fire, which is close by to Fresno, but my guess that we can extend it to all California, in the sense that we're going through a virus. We're going through a pandemic, and then on top of that, we have unprecedented levels of fires throughout the state. How is that going to be affecting overall the whole picture, at least for California?
So from an economic standpoint, it throws it makes things more difficult. More people, myself certainly, are staying home more. I don't want to go outside when the air is as bad as it is. The economies local to the fires, devastated. Any other economies surrounding that sort of relied on goods and services from the economies that have been hit, some more harm. Not much direct harm to economies like the Bay Area, except that people aren't going out. And it's going to be hurtful to restaurants that maybe were coming back because they could serve food outside. Well, nobody wants to go sit outside to eat during the wildfires. So I think that, from an economic perspective, it's just piling on. And mostly it's going to be the same sectors that were affected by the virus that will be affected by the fires, except locally. From a pandemic perspective, to the extent that it's keeping people at home, this might not be all that politically correct to say, but there are certain synergies here. I mean, the fires are getting people to do what maybe we should have been doing to keep things under control. It'd be really interesting to see what happens to infection rates in California in the wake of the fires.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Let's just go with one last questions that we have. It says, do you foresee any type of market correction in the residential real estate market, or do you foresee continued increase in demand and rise in prices?
Yeah, I don't in residential, except to the extent that there might be additional foreclosures at the end of the day. That will certainly have an impact. I don't have a good sense for how big a problem that might be. My hope is not huge, but it could be. I don't know. I haven't seen data on the hardship inflicted by tenure, by home ownership status.
Yeah, I also kind of feel the same way. I don't think that we're going to see much of an impact. At least I think that prices here are going to be stabilized, or we'll see even a little bit of an increase, maybe a little drop, but I don't think that they're going to be much affected, at least regionally. I hear a lot of realtors that they're, even in the middle of this pandemic, they're as busy as they could ever be. So, that's got to mean something, right?
Yeah, and going back to what I said earlier, it depends on where you are, right? In urban cores, there's a bit of an exodus out to suburban areas. So looking at aggregate statistics, we won't see much of a change in trajectory, but maybe in specific locations, yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, John, I think you have another presentation coming up, or I think
I do in about 20 minutes, so I should probably get going.
So thank you so much again. It was wonderful. Thank you for speaking to us. We'll be inviting you on other topics as well in soon, I promise. So if there's anything that anybody wants from John, I'll have his information posted on our website, and we have a survey that we sent out to ask about, how do you like this presentation and so on and so on. We'll share that information with John as well. But thank you so much for attending today's presentation. And next presentation, just to say the date, is going to be on October 22nd, and we'll hear from our local Preston Prince, who is the executive director, president, CEO of the Fresno Housing of Fresno. So thank you so much, John. Great. Thank you.
Thank you for having me in.
I usually have or give a bottle of Fresno State wine to our speakers, but I'll figure out how to get it. But if not, I'll owe you one, and I'll get it whenever we meet.
Sounds good. I'll collect at some point in the future. Thanks for having me in. Thanks to everybody who came.
Appreciate it.
I am the executive director of a nonprofit, so I'm obligated to say that if you enjoyed this, your support would be much appreciated. And there's no such thing as a gift too big or too small. And I'll send a link to our donate button to AJ, who I hope will circulate it. Thanks everybody, and be well.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much for attending.